nuclear science. I love my classes. I got a crazy teacher who wears dark glasses. Things are going great, and they're only getting better.
Hey, welcome back to Public Speaking. This is Chapter 13 from the Zarefsky and Engels Public Speaking textbook, and this chapter is on the content of informing. In this chapter, in this video, we're going to focus on making sure we have real clarity on the difference between informative and persuasive speeches and strategies. We're going to talk specifically about the informative strategies and then a little bit about how to design so that essential information will be remembered and you can increase audience retention. When you get started on an informative speech, you want to think about your strategy. And we referenced this at the beginning of the semester, how when you start working on creating or crafting your speech, that you should have a strategy. And that starts by getting a very clear, specific purpose. Hopefully at this point, you've had an opportunity to get your specific purpose much more concrete and fleshed it out to be really focused on the impact of the audience. Keep in mind that the audience and the occasion create restraints and opportunities. So sometimes an audience doesn't know much about your topic, and that can be a restraint, but it can also be an opportunity to give them all kinds of information. When it's a restraint, it often comes in the form of sort of keeping you boxed in about how much you can talk about it or how complex the information is you can present if your audience doesn't know much about it. And those needs that the audience has impact your specific purpose. Sometimes audiences need to be informed so they can be persuaded. Sometimes they need to be persuaded before they can be informed. Overall, our purpose here is informing the audience, but sometimes information is all people need to be persuaded. And that's really what your authors are referring to there, is that information alone can be enough to persuade people. So what questions will you consider based on your particular topic? What questions about the audience do you need to have answered so you can narrow down the content that you want to include? Your textbook also points out that there are two reasons that informative speeches get into the public eye, and that is that they provide information to help audiences think about topics that affect people, and they provide information for decision making. If you're doing a public speech, even in a classroom setting, you're giving people information and they're either going to think about the topic in a way they haven't before, you're going to raise their awareness, maybe you're going to change how positively they think about it, or maybe you're going to give them information they need to make a choice about the topic. All right, the goals of the informative speech is what we're going to focus on next. We looked at the strategy, let's look at our goals. And when we think about our three primary goals, we think about inform, persuade, and entertain. Certainly this is to inform. If you think about the list of 5 goals that we had, where we had inform, persuade, instruct, or inspire, certainly this includes instruct. Then there was that additional list of, I think, 7 goals from Chapter 6. You could add to our list of goals for informative speeches to provide new information or provide perspective. So essentially, this is like enriching the audience, and it's typically when general knowledge is all the audience has, you're sort of updating or enriching their knowledge. It's not likely to create too much dramatic effect or change, but it is an important element in informing the audience. Agenda setting is when we're trying to move the topic up in the priority of the audience's mind. So you're trying to sort of raise awareness, bring the topic to the forefront of their mind, get them to think about something they had not before, or get them to think about it more, make it more important to them. The third goal from that list that applies to informative speeches is create positive or negative feeling about a topic. When we're not knowledgeable about something, we are often at the mercy of other people and what their knowledge is about a topic. So sometimes you can create a positive or a negative feeling by giving people information. It makes them feel armed, it makes them feel prepared or even in control sometimes. And all of that makes people feel like they have the capacity to make intelligent decisions, intelligent choices. And that creates a really positive feeling in people. To accomplish any of these purposes, we would rely on informative strategies, and that's where we're going to spend the bulk of our time in this video. So next we have sort of a preview of the informative speech strategies, and they are define, report, describe, explain, demonstrate, tell a story, and compare. And keep in mind as we go through here that these often overlap, and that's okay. That's okay. So let's take a minute and get started looking at the strategy. So the first strategy for informative speeches is to define. And by that we mean either clarify a term or concept that's vague or troublesome, or another way to think of it is introducing a new way to view a subject. Remember that not all definitions are neutral. For example, there are lots of words that have meanings that come from the culture that we're a part of. So think about, for example, there used to be a phrase people used quite often, and they would say, "Don't gyp me." And that came from an understanding of how people who were transient often were not perceived as credible or as honest, and they would be perceived as people who tried to sell something for more than it was worth. And that evolved over time, and it eventually became associated with other ethnic groups, and now essentially means all kinds of layers of additional meaning, and consequently isn't neutral at all. A phrase or a word that we use now that has evolved into a new meaning in the last 2 decades that never ever had the possibility of meaning the same thing as it does now is footprint. We used to think of the word footprint as just basically where your foot landed, the foot of anything landed, right? And if you could see it on the ground, then that was your footprint. And now we think of it in a much more abstract way, such as our carbon footprint. And if your carbon footprint is included in a sentence that makes it negative, that certainly isn't a neutral definition either. So think about that with language. Sometimes we're trying to get people to sort of change how they think about things. There's a great example of affirmative action in your textbook where the author released some information about from a student's speech about affirmative action and how she's trying to say, hey, think about what affirmative action was originally, which is, not at all how people usually think about it now. And I'm going to share an example from the John Wooden speech where he tries to create his own definition. And I want you to think about definitions from this point of view too. We'll just listen to a little bit of this.
But I didn't like it. I didn't agree with it. And I wanted to come up with something that I hope could make me a better teacher and give the youngsters under my supervision, whether it be in athletics or in the English classroom, something to which to aspire other than just a higher mark in the classroom or more points in some athletic contest. And I thought about that for quite a spell, and I wanted to come up with my own definition. I thought that might help. And I knew how Mr. Webster defined it as the accumulation of material possessions or the attainment of a position of power or prestige or something of that sort, worthy accomplishments perhaps, but in my opinion not necessarily indicative of success. So I wanted to come up with something of my own. And I recalled I was raised on a small farm in southern Indiana, and Dad tried to teach me and my brothers that you should never try to be better than someone else. I'm sure at the time he did that. It didn't. Well, somewhere, I guess, in the hidden recesses of the mind, it popped out years later. Never try to be better than someone else. Always learn from others. And never cease trying to be the best you could be. That's under your control. And if you get too engrossed and involved and concerned in regard to things over which you have no control, it will adversely affect the things over which you have control. Then I ran across a simple verse that said, "At God's footstool to confess, a poor soul knelt and bowed his head. I failed," he cried. The Master said, "Thou didst thy best." That is success. From those things, and one other perhaps, I coined my own definition of success, which is peace of mind, attained only through self-satisfaction in knowing you made the effort to do the best of which you're capable. I believe that's true. If you make the effort to do the best of which you're capable, trying to improve the situation that exists for you, I think that's success.
There's Mr. Woodens, who is a fantastic coach. He was at UCLA, still has an incredible winning record, and that's his example of making his own definition. And that's the first strategy you can use to approach and craft your informative speech. The next two strategies we'll look at are called report and describe. And the report strategy is essentially like journalism in the oral way. So it answers the question of what happened, and it's usually when you need to share information in a chronological order. So I'm going to share an example from Hillary Clinton's speech on criminal justice reform that she gave at Columbia University in 2015. It's part of a policy speech, which means she is asking for a response from the audience, but she had to inform in the first part of her speech in order to set the agenda, and of course she was trying to move people to action. This is the beginning of the description of a second area of focus she thought reform should include. Let's pause for just a second and look at this.
Of what ails us today. The second area where we need to chart a new course is how we approach punishment in prison. It's a stark fact that the United States has less than 5% of the world's population, yet we have almost 25% of the world's total prison population. The numbers today are much higher than they were 30, 40 years ago, despite the fact that crime is at historic lows. Of the more than 2 million Americans incarcerated today, a significant percentage are low-level offenders, people held for violating parole or minor drug crimes, or who are simply awaiting trial in backlogged courts.
Okay, so the Hillary example from Columbia University that was video available from Bloomberg.com, by the way, is a great example of reporting. She made an effort to relate the facts in that segment with little interpretation. She shared them with some emphasis and dynamism in her voice. And if you really think about it, it's hard to tell if you're interpreting any bias in that information based on things you already knew about her or her politics, or was it actually in the voice and the presentation of that data? If it was someone you'd never heard before, you might have found that any bias you heard came just from how she presented the information. But the point of reporting is to make an effort to relate information with little analysis or interpretation. Often it's new information. In this case, some of the people in the audience might have had some information. I believe she was at the College of Law there, but they might not have. Or maybe some of it was new and some of it wasn't. It can't possibly be entirely objective, hence my point earlier about the dynamism in her voice. This strategy is a great choice when the topic needs to be broken down part by part. And in this case, she was demonstrating, look at this sort of juxtaposition. This seems kind of out of whack. Mostly it's used, though, to share new information and potentially create new perspective for the audience. The other strategy we're going to focus on this slide is describe. And describing is an informative strategy we use to paint a mental picture for the audience. So as the speaker is talking, the audience should be able to imagine the same picture that the speaker is describing. It's usually very effective when there's quite a bit of detail. And I'm going to share an example of that with you as well. But let's go through just a little bit more of what it means. becomes vivid through the details, as I said. And then it's also a really useful strategy when you know your audience already shares your appraisal of the topic. So in this example from Elizabeth Warren, which by the way is a describing strategy and overlaps with the storytelling strategy, I think you'll find that her audience was likely to have some familiarity with the topic, and that made it easy for her to describe this story to them.
I cannot describe to you how crazy the idea was of my going to law school. My mother said many, many times, very loudly, that she thought I was jeopardizing my marriage. My brothers, all three of them, just thought I was plain nuts. And my then husband smiled indulgently, making it clear that he knew I could not possibly pull this off. But I bowed my head, I pushed on. You might say, nevertheless, I persisted. But I was determined. And so I took all the needed exams, I filled out the application, I budgeted and figured out how I could pay the $450 tuition. I worked out the commute in my trusty blue Volkswagen, and I had it all figured out, all of it, until I hit the one big boulder that nearly crushed me: childcare. My daughter Amelia was about to turn 2, and if I wanted to go to law school, I needed childcare. And I know it sounds like I wasn't very smart, but I hadn't really realized exactly how hard that was going to be. You know, I visited all kinds of places. I went everywhere, and I struck out everywhere. They cost a fortune, or they smelled funny, or the kids looked miserable. And this went on for weeks. And it's getting to be the end of the summer, and I'm starting to sweat. We were bearing down on the start of school, and I knew that if I couldn't get childcare worked out, my idea of going back to school was over before it started. And finally, less than 1 week before classes were starting, I found a place that seemed nice. Cheerful teachers, a good playground, smelled good. That thing matters, you know? There was only one problem. They only took children who were dependably potty trained. Man, I filled out that application. I said, sure, dependably potty trained. Got it. We are so on this. And I left there knowing I had 5 days to turn my not quite 2-year-old into a ready-to-go, dependably potty-trained partner.
So you can see that when Elizabeth Warren is speaking to a women's law group, other attorneys who are female, and many of whom have tried to figure out how to do it all, be professionals and raise their children and get to school, all three plus probably several other tasks, that she knew she would have an audience who shared her appraisal of the challenges of doing that. So she described a story that people really resonated with, and consequently she definitely created a feeling that's very positive about the topic, and probably also about her by doing that. So describing can be a terrific strategy for creating positive feelings. It can also help audiences envision the future, which we'll spend a little bit more time on when we talk about persuasive speeches. So we've had 3 strategies so far: defining, reporting, and describing. Let's look at strategy number 4, which is explaining. When we're trying to explain, we're trying to share a deeper understanding, try to help people get a better breadth and depth of a topic. The topic of the speech can influence the organization of it. Events or people, we tend to begin simple and expand to more complex understanding of the events or the people. Policies or processes, we tend to begin something complex and boil it down to simpler nuggets to make it really easy for people to walk away with a clear understanding of the basic steps or the basic elements of a policy. So if you think about explaining and you think about the example of the Cuban Missile Crisis, you can understand that that was a complex event, right? And there were lots of interpretations of it. And so this is an informative strategy where you have some choice. This isn't like reporting where you're trying really hard to be objective. This is explaining where you have some choice about telling what you appreciate or agree with is the accurate interpretation of what happened. And by doing that, you sometimes also have influence in the audience or over the audience. And that's what we mean when we say informing speeches aren't always just about informing. Think another example, think about the idea of gentrification. Gentrification means to conform house or housing areas to middle class tastes. Well, gentrification has become a thing, especially in larger cities, where it's perceived and appreciated as a very negative thing. You might think, wow, why would making, sort of raising homes up to a higher level that have been sort of run down and haven't been taken care of? Well, the problem is for people who have been living in those places that haven't been well taken care of, or because of lots of very valid reasons, that once the quality of it is raised, many times those people can no longer afford to live there. And if you are the person who has lost their home, gentrification has a really negative context for you, a negative connotation for you. So explaining, much like defining, can really change how we appreciate a topic. All right, let's look at demonstrating. Not going to spend much time here because you guys have already done a demonstration speech, but this enables the audience to do something. By the time they are finished watching and listening to your speech, they should be able to grasp how to do it or even actually execute it. Some things to consider when you're preparing a demonstration is that, do the listeners really need to see the process to understand it? Sometimes you can describe a process without doing the process for them and they can grasp it. Really think about that. Is the subject precise enough to demonstrate in the time you have available? Lots of you had ideas about demonstration speeches that weren't going to work in a 3 to 4 minute speech. Can you make the steps clear, distinct, and in proper sequence? If you can't, it's probably not a great topic for demonstrating. And are your actions and verbal instructions coordinated? Make sure you say what you're doing when you do it, not after or before. Visual aids tend to strengthen demonstrations, which is why we require them in the speech that we do in this class for demonstration. So we have demonstrating as another approach to an informative speech. It's another strategy. Storytelling is an additional strategy. I want to say it's the 6th one. It relates a narrative to a topic that events fit together in a plot. So one thing, it's important that they follow in that order. Storytelling can create negative or positive feelings about a topic, much like other strategies we've looked at. Storytelling can build interest in a topic, especially if the audience is unfamiliar. This is a great way to lead an audience to an increased interest in a topic by using storytelling. It also provides structure and organization for the speech because it's a plot and those elements have to be done in sequence. Let's take a look at an example from a TEDx Women's speech in 2012.
When I was 11, I remember waking up one morning to the sound of joy in my house. My father was listening to BBC News on his small gray radio. There was a big smile on his face, which was unusual then because the news mostly depressed him. "The Taliban are gone," my father shouted. I didn't know what it meant, But I could see that my father was very, very happy. "You can go to a real school now," he said. A morning that I will never forget. A real school. You see, I was 6 when Taliban took over Afghanistan and made it illegal for girls to go to school. So for the next 5 years, I dressed as a boy to escort my older sister, who was no longer allowed to be outside alone, to a secret school. It was the only way we both could be educated. Each day, we took a different route so that no one would suspect where we were going. We would cover our books in grocery bags so it would seem we were just out shopping. The school was in a house, more than 100 of us packed in one small living room. It was cozy in winter, but extremely hot in summer. We all knew we were risking our lives, the teacher, the students, and our parents. From time to time, a school would suddenly be canceled for a week because Taliban were suspicious. We always wondered what they knew about us. Were we being followed? Do they know where we live? We were scared, but still, school was where we wanted to be.
So a terrific story about what it was like for her to go to school in secret and then realize finally she wasn't going to have to look out for herself or her sibling to go to school because she was a girl and it was available to her in freedom at that point. So a great way to create probably negative feelings of sort of sadness and empathy. And then I'm sure if you listen to the entire speech, which is available on TED.com, you can hear the entire speech and you could just see how everyone sort of lifts up. So she creates this negative feeling and then swings everyone back positive by the outcome of the story. The very last strategy for informative speeches is comparison. And comparison is, strictly speaking, comparison is showing likenesses or similarities. But for the purposes of what we're doing, it's an informative speech strategy where you show similarities and differences, not technically like the definition. It can be used to show the category of a topic. For example, is a required freshman skills class that focuses on things like study skills and time management. Is that an investment in fundamentals for a university, or is it redundant and wasteful? Those are two entirely different categories, as you can see. Another way of thinking about the use of the comparison strategy is to provide a basis for making a choice. So you can inform people about two options, but not be asking them for action, because that would be a persuasive speech. So sometimes you need to inform them about the options, and that still falls under an informative speech as long as you're not asking for action. So the 7 strategies for informative speech making include defining, reporting, describing, explaining, demonstrating, telling a story, and comparing. And don't forget that we typically, or very often at least, have two strategies sort of overlapping. It's almost never do we have strictly one of those strategies without the other. The last piece we're going to look at in this chapter is about encouraging your audience to retain as much of what you say to them as possible. This is called the forgetting curve. And I share this because you never, why would you want to get up and give a speech that everyone's going to forget, right? Take a look at this curve from your textbook, and you can see that as time increases, how much people recall from a speech, beginning when the speech is over, decreases. And it's a sharp, sharp decline. They forget most of it right away. And so as a result of this curve that was discovered in social science research a few decades ago, you want to do some things to try to get your listeners to recall more. And a couple of ways you can do that are engaging listeners in sort of active listening, what's really sort of mentally active. Challenge them to think, challenge them to play out a conversation or a situation in their minds. Either ask them rhetorical questions or real questions that you expect them to answer through a nod of head or a show of hands. You can ask listeners to recall information. That's another way to engage them as active listeners. You can do that by asking them to recall something as part of a question and answer element in your speech, or you can ask them to recall by using an internal summary. You can reinforce. That is another strategy you can use to increase retention. And by this, what we mean is reinforce when the audience is being an active listener or doing things that help them remember. So when you give them rewarding feedback for remembering, so whatever seems like it encourages the audience can be reinforcing or rewarding feedback. Even something like a good organizational pattern that works with the content is a way of reinforcing the content in their brain. And so that's a way of increasing retention. Another way to increase retention through the reinforcement strategy is to use we instead of you in the language you choose when you are speaking to them. There are several style elements in Chapter 12, which we have not done yet, but in Chapter 12 there are several style elements that can help you increase the chance that your audience will remember what you're talking about. Okay, where have we been? Here's the wrap-up. Informative speech strategies don't intend to influence, but they might, whether you mean to or not. They provide new information or perspective. They can function to set agendas and create positive or negative feelings. That comes from the section in this unit on goals. Any combination of these informative strategies can be used and should be. Define, report, describe, explain, demonstrate, storytelling, and compare. And finally, use whatever you can to increase the chances that your audience will remember what you've been talking about longer after your speech is finished. Thank you so much for your time. We'll see you next time.
Better.